This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers and scholars, or simply people of ideas of all types and vocations who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. My guest today is a political scientist at Bar-Ilan University here in Israel and the author of a new book entitled The Arab-Israeli Conflict in American Political Culture that has recently been published in English by Cambridge University Press. Dr. Jonathan Reinhold, welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello, thank you.
So it's a long-standing truism that American support for Israel is really all-encompassing. It cuts through political persuasions, religious beliefs, levels of education, vocations, and what have you, really. Now, the reasons for that are manifold. There's the theological explanation, the cultural one, the philosophical one, strategic, political, and so on. Now, by way of introduction, I'd like to ask you, which one of these is perhaps the most decisive?
Well, I think you need to think of them as a coalition in the sense that none of them can stand on their own and explain it on its own. And together they create a coalition which creates a majority which wins. So you can't reduce it to one. And even if you say that one may be at certain times more important than the other, the most important thing is that without all of them together, you don't have a special relationship. So, for example, one can say that the fact that Israel has been a strategic asset to the United States has led to an increase in aid. The fact that Israel has a lot of political support in the Congress means it's very difficult for administration to reduce that aid. But the underlying support and sympathy of the public, which is for religious and cultural reasons, fuels that and holds it together. It's the ozone layer. Without that, if strategic interests change, policy can change. Without that underlying support, the political support for Israel in the Congress and elsewhere would dissipate because it doesn't exist in a vacuum.
But still, strategic interests have changed, namely the end of the Cold War. We are in a very, very different reality, especially here in the Middle East now than we were 30 or 40 years ago. Yet the overwhelming support for Israel hasn't really changed. If anything, it has increased.
So here's the thing. One has to distinguish between how people feel about Israel in America, what their sympathies are, and what their political attitudes are, and what the policies of the American administration are. Sympathy for Israel has never been as high as it has been in the last 15 years. Since 9/11, for the first time consistently, an absolute majority of Americans, almost two-thirds, sympathize with Israel over the Palestinians. It's always been...
as opposed to how many before?
It was less than 50%. It was always a ratio of 3-1, generally. Okay. But the thing is, the numbers have gone up, and that's mainly to do with 9/11. And that has gone up for old people, Republicans and Democrats. The one group that hasn't gone up is young Democrats, but it's flat. It hasn't gone down. So sympathy is, very, very powerful. Americans feel it. It's very deep. It goes back to the 19th century. American Zionism, non-Jewish, precedes Jewish Zionism, precedes Herzl by 50, 60, 70 years. But, and this is an important but, Americans are more divided about what are their strategic interests than they have ever been, how to think about foreign policy. And that means they're more divided about what policy towards the Arab-Israeli conflict in Israel should be. And critically, this divide lines up with the increasing polarization in American politics. So on one side, you have Republicans, conservatives, evangelical Christians, and Orthodox Jews. And on the other side, you have Democrats who are increasingly liberal, increasingly secular, and non-Orthodox Jews. And those groups are increasingly congealing into two tribes that are increasingly far apart on what to do about American foreign policy, and therefore what the policy towards Israel and Iran should be, what the policy towards Israel and the Palestinians should be, not whether they love Israel. So if we take the group that's least sympathetic to Israel in America, which is young, secular, liberal, university-educated Americans, the levels of their sympathy are higher than the most pro-Israel demographic in Europe, which is middle-aged, conservative voters. Okay? So America's different. But politically, the link between loving Israel, feeling sympathy for Israel, and political support for the policies of Israel is now being broken.
The comparison that you just evoked to Europe is fascinating because the correlation is inverse in a way, that the level of support for Israel in Europe has steadily gone down over the years, the latter half of the 20th century to perhaps the lowest ebb now. At the same time, there was a steady increase in America. So how do you explain that? Why didn't a level of support at least remain steady in Europe?
Yeah. Okay, so if we look at Europe, sympathy for Israel, most people don't care, okay, unlike Americans, okay? But among those who care, between the foundation of the state and the late 1970s, those who supported Israel were mainly on the liberal left, the centre left, not the far left, but the centre left, the Labour Party in England, the Liberal Party in England, the socialists in France, etc. And they supported Israel for two reasons. One, because it was weak. They were the victims. They'd suffered a lot in the Holocaust. There was a certain amount of guilt, but there was also a certain amount that you should just support the weak. That's kind of what left-wing parties tend to do. And the other thing was Israel's a democracy. And when you look at the world in 1948, you have to remember there are only about 24, 25 democracies. Half European countries are communist dictatorships. Some of those Western European democracies were fascist in the Second World War, or Nazi even. And so Israel is this...
Not just a democracy, a left-leaning democracy.
A social democratic democracy. In many ways, it was the light to which the centre-left in Europe, the democratic, looked to learn from. And so it had very, very high standing, somewhat unrealistic. Not that Israel didn't deserve it. It was, Israel and India are the only two countries that have been democratic all the way through that received their independence after the Second World War. So it's based on something, but it was also idealized. The difference between the American liberal and the European left is that when Israel became strong, the European left, that became a problem. The Europeans say Israel is white, Israel is strong, Israel is wrong. Israel is white, Israel is, as it were, a colonial country, as it were. And it is now stronger than the Palestinians, so we sympathize with the weak and the victim. And Israel still has its supporters on the left who support it because it's a democracy, but they're outnumbered because the European left is different from the American left. The American left is more about, are you a democracy? It's more about your values. It's a liberal country. Liberals believe what you do and what you say is what counts, because Americans believe that the American dream, everyone can do what they want. Everyone can make their own life good. So they look at Israel and said, you made a democracy. You built a great country. You made the right choices. We criticize your non-liberal policies, but we identify with you as a democracy, as we do with America. I'm a liberal in America. I don't like the Iraq War. I'm a liberal in America. I don't like some of the settlement policies, but I identify with America as a democracy. I identify with Israel as a democracy. I know the difference between Iran and Israel. In Europe, the left has a different foundation. It comes out of class politics. Who's strong and who's weak? The Labour Party represented the working class, the trade unions, the socialists. The left and the right in Europe didn't start as democracies. Liberalism isn't a foundation as it is in America. So they said Israel becomes strong. We oppose it. Never mind its values. That's secondary. And so the balance within the left in America and Europe is different. You get both kinds. The values leftists who tend to be more sympathetic to Israel, even if they're critical of policies. But the class leftists who are more Marxist, they tend to be anti-Zionist, anti-Israel. Israel is wrong until proven otherwise. Whereas in America, liberals will say, Israel's a democracy, that's fantastic, but I don't like this policy because it's not a liberal policy.
So maybe in America there's a clearer distinction between support for Israel for the idea for, being Zionist in the broader sense of the term, and support for Israeli policies, whereas in Europe, perhaps, the Israeli policies and opposition to them reflect on sympathy for Israel altogether.
No, it's the other way around. In Europe, the whole idea of Zionism on the left is something that is very hard to defend. On the right, or the centre-right, not the right as in fascist or anything like that, the conservative side, they may not have any particular sympathies with Israel, but they see we have common enemies with radical Islam. And so you see policies of people like David Cameron changing from 2009 when he said Gaza was a large prison camp to this year, to 2014 when he was the first to say Israel had a right to self-defense in the Gaza war. In America, it's different. There are very few people who are anti-Zionist. What they say is we sympathize with Israel because it's democracy, but that doesn't necessarily lead us to support its policies, because our support for Israel is based on our values as a liberal democracy, and Israel shares those values. But just like when our society does things that we believe doesn't conform to those values, we don't become anti-American, we become anti-a-policy. It's the same with Israel. So there's a difference for Americans. Support for Israeli defense, aid, anti-missile systems is, in Obama's words, unbreakable and unshakable and consensual. And that's why Obama says in every single interview it's unbreakable and unshakable, because he knows even his most liberal Democratic base in his own party believe that deeply. And it's not something you can break. No European leader speaks like Obama about Israel. And that's even when you have European leaders who on policy questions may actually be closer to the Israeli view. Britain and France on Iran between 2005 and 2013 were closer. But you will never hear a British or French prime minister or president say what Obama said, which is, why do we support Israel? Because we share a common story. You just don't say that. But Americans believe that Israel is like America. America is a country of immigrants, made up of people who fled Europe, fleeing religious persecution, who set up a democracy, a pioneering democracy, one that's innovative. They look at Israel and they say, wow, you are the same as us. Ronald Reagan said there is no country like us in the world except Israel. 75% of Americans believe that America is exceptional. Okay, so that means Israel has this special place.
Is that sustainable over time? Don't you see a generational change looming, as many have warned?
So I think, again, one needs to look at the difference between underlying sympathies and policy. Sympathies are incredibly robust. It's unbelievable that Americans remain deeply American and deeply different from Europeans, and sympathy is robust even among young people. Where there's a difference is a willingness to connect that with the ability to mobilize support for Israeli policy. That was there in the past. It isn't now. In other words, Republicans and conservatives tend to think that Israeli and American interests are more or less aligned. We share common values and we share common enemies. Therefore, we share common interests, and a victory for Israel is a victory for America. A defeat for Israel is a defeat for America. On the 10th of September 2001, the leading conservative columnist, not Jewish, not a neoconservative, in the Washington Post, George Will, wrote, "This is the end of our holiday from history. We will now be facing the same challenges as Israel." On the other side of the map, Democrats and liberals increasingly feel a distance between Israeli security policies and its policies on settlements and what they believe is the right way forward in terms of American values and American interest in the Middle East, because Republicans and Democrats are more divided than they have ever been on foreign policy, including Vietnam. Americans were very divided on Vietnam, but it wasn't such a partisan issue. The Iraq War, the Iran agreement are more partisan, and Israel slots into that argument. And so Israel's ability to garner consensual support for anything other than defensive measures, for defensive support, which is significant. Intelligence cooperation, $3 billion a year in aid, qualitative edge. These are not small things. But the ability to maneuver and to garner American support for Israeli policy on the peace process, or when Israel wants to take offensive measures or deterrence measures, is shrinking because these are partisan issues in America themselves.
Mm-hmm. I have a methodological question now about political culture.
Yeah.
What is it for you and how do you really define it?
Okay, political culture is the the values, the norms of behavior, the identity and the beliefs of the American people. And it can be measured in a number of ways. One is to look at the elite discourse about these things among intellectuals and among leading figures and politicians. Another is to look at survey data over a long period of time of the American public. And a third thing to do is look at the founding documents and ideas that have a long-term support and are very foundational, such as the Constitution of America, things like that, and compare those with other countries and see how these things remain constant even as the world around them changes.
Mm-hmm. Perhaps the most striking thing that I came across in your book is that you ascribe relatively low importance to the power of perhaps the two biggest pro-Israel lobbies in American society, the Jewish community and the evangelical community, that really the support for Israel cuts across all denominations. Tell us a bit about that. Am I reading you correctly? Do you think that the power is relatively marginal in constructing the debate?
I use a metaphor, and that is sympathy for Israel can be considered like water. Okay? You can have the best plumbing system, the best pipes in the world. That's the pro-Israel lobby. But if you don't have water, you don't have good water pressure, you won't get anywhere. So my point is, without widespread, deep, long-lasting sympathy for Israel, the fact that evangelicals and American Jews are the most intensely pro-Israel, the fact that they're the best organized, that they have the best plumbing, wouldn't help you. Once you've got that support, the fact that there are 1 million members of a pro-Israel lobby of evangelicals, the fact that AIPAC has the biggest conference in Washington at 16,000 people, and that there's no hall in Washington big enough for them to have a sit-down dinner. They have to have a buffet. It's significant, right? It's very significant. That is what allows them to convert sympathy, which is diffuse, into political currency. But the issue is this. 40 years ago, in 1975, 500 people went to an AIPAC conference. Today, it's 16,000. Is AIPAC more powerful or less powerful? So I would say less. It has a bigger budget. It has more supporters. But in 1975, when you went into the pro-Israel room, there were 10 people, and 9 of them were saying the same message politically, and one of them was a Meshuggah. He said some strange things. Okay, all right. So if you're an American politician, you get a very clear message. What does it mean to be pro-Israel? You go into that room now, there are now 50 people in that room, and let's say between 35 and 40 are saying the same thing. They're saying the AIPAC line. But there are 5 or 6 saying something more right-wing and 5 or 6 saying something more left-wing. If you're an American politician, you come out of that room and you're confused.
And that's without mentioning J Street.
Well, J Street's in the room. So so let's say 35 say AIPAC. Let's say 8 or 9 say J Street, and 4 or 5 say the Zionist Organization of America, which is more right-wing. If you're an American politician, first of all, you hear a lot of noise. It's unclear what the message is. And second of all, you can pick what it means to be pro-Israel. And one of the political directors of AIPAC in the 1990s said, AIPAC's power comes from what it means, from its ability to define what it means to be pro-Israel. It's losing that ability. So you've got more supporters, but you can't define it in the public discourse. Everyone can say, I'm pro-Israel and I'm against the Iran agreement. I'm pro-Israel and I'm for the Iran agreement.
So that brings me again to the question I asked before about the distinction between support for Israel and support for Israeli policies. Maybe
Yes.
because Israeli policies are increasingly in conflict with American interests, with American policies, with the way Americans perceive themselves, maybe that projects on the overall support for Israel generally.
So first of all, Republicans on the right are more supportive of Israeli policy and Democrats less. In other words, it's not like you can say Americans are less. It's polarized in America, and it's polarized about Middle East. It's polarized about foreign policy.
Isn't that because Obama is the president
No.
and the enemy of your enemy is your friend?
No, it's because since 2001, there has been a growing divide during Bush, during Obama. In fact, it grew much larger during Bush rather than Obama. On the questions, for example, do you think that Islam is a religion that encourages violence more than other religions? in 2001, immediately 2002, immediately after 9/11, a majority of Republicans and Democrats thought, no, they don't. And the differences were small, maybe 10% more Republicans agreed. Now, double the amount of Republicans believe it compared to Democrats. 2/3 of Republicans, 1/3 of Democrats. You ask about, the utility of diplomacy versus force in foreign policy. 20 years ago, the Republicans were slightly more hawkish, 5-10% more. Now, a large majority of Republicans are more hawkish. They believe in, force to deal with problems. Whereas a majority of Democrats, although Democrats are more divided, think that diplomacy is the main thing. And these things have nothing to do with Israel. Israel just slots into this divide that's pre-existing.
Mm-hmm. That's actually counterintuitive in the wake of the Iraq War. You would expect them to see that force perhaps is not the best solution to international conflict.
So here's the thing, is that Republicans recognize that, the Iraq War wasn't such a good idea. But they draw a distinction between using force for, making democracies and human rights and using force preemptively to stop the bad guys. Mm-hmm. And so on Iran, most Republicans are worried that America won't act quickly enough, and most Democrats are worried that America will act too soon. Okay? Just to give you a sense of the fact that Israel isn't the key thing, a polling that was done by the Jewish Journal in LA in July when the Iran agreement came out showed that even among those American Jews who had a mostly favorable, not the most, mostly favorable view of Netanyahu, a majority supported the agreement. Mm-hmm. In other words, American Jews are liberal, they're dovish. Okay, even if they like Netanyahu personally, they were in favor of the agreement. Only the small majority, I think that's between a 10 and 20%, who really support Netanyahu were against the agreement, which says something. It says that the difference between, my sympathies, even with Netanyahu, who, you may not like his policies, I'm still in favor of the agreement. I love Netanyahu and I love the agreement.
So perhaps now American Jews and others are expected for the first time ever to choose between allegiance to their country, to their president, and to the prime minister, to the leadership of the Jewish state. And I don't understand how this cannot affect the support for Israel, because at the end of the day, as you say, most align with their own president.
So that's, this is the problem with the Israeli way of looking at things, which is reflected by the prime minister, that makes it an issue of loyalty. And by making it an issue of loyalty, he significantly reduced the chances of winning, not that they were great, and did damage in the long term, because actually what happens is, like I said, for most American Jews, they are comfortable supporting Israel and supporting. There's not an issue of loyalty, really. But by making it partisan, by going to Congress at the behest of the Republicans, and then by talking in this way, people around the prime minister, not him himself, it made it an issue that American Jews who are liberal and Obama felt like, many of them, this is, if I don't know what I think about the agreement, I'm not sure, I'm going to go with Obama because he's like, I generally identify with that. And I like Bibi and I like Israel, but politics on this, I go by my ideology and my political identification. So by making it partisan, by Bibi walking straight into that partisan trap, and also particularly Ron Dermer, the ambassador, who's a former card-carrying Republican, he pushed large amounts of American Jews, I think, to be much more virulently, and Democratic senators to be much more virulently pro-Obama. Now, I suspect he would have lost anyway. You can't beat a president who really makes this a key issue, but it's done damage to bipartisan political support for Israel because it's led Democrats to believe that Netanyahu's playing domestic politics. Yeah. And if you do that, American Jews, even more than American non-Jews, resent it. American Jewish Congress people resent it.
But that's just a bump on the road, you're saying. It may go back to what it was.
It's not a bump on the road, no. It won't affect underlying sympathy for Israel. People will continue to sympathize with Israel, the country, and Israel, the project, and Zionism, but their willingness to politically support the policies of Israel will be, well, why should we? Mm-hmm. Why should we do that? You mess around, you just intervene in our politics, you attack our candidates. we're not going to do it.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you one final question because we're quickly running out of time. Do you think that America can still, or in the foreseeable future, play a positive role in mediating the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Are they really going to bring about its solution?
Okay, on this, I think there's quite a wide consensus in America. And that spins around the line said by James Baker when he was Secretary of State in 1991. It's been repeated by every Secretary of State since, including also the current President Obama. And that is that America can do a lot to facilitate peace and help. It can have secret talks, it can give aid, it can reassure, it can sometimes pressure the sides, but it cannot want peace more than the parties themselves. In other words, at the end of the day, we have to live here with the Palestinians, the Syrians, if there are such a thing anymore as Syrians, Egypt, Lebanon, whatever. And the Americans go home. And even if they help, we have to own it. If we don't own it, the agreement will simply fall apart. The Americans understand that they've got a lot of experience in international conflicts. They've seen that their prestige is damaged when they reach agreements that fall apart afterwards. So the Americans can help, but at the end of the day, it's up to the sides. And if the sides aren't truly committed, it doesn't matter how clever and how sophisticated and how much money the Americans throw at it, it won't help. And that's really what we saw in 2001 when Arafat rejected the Clinton parameters.
Mm-hmm. All right. Dr. Jonathan Reinhold, I'm afraid this is all we have time for. You're a political scientist at Bar-Ilan University and the author of the new book, The Arab-Israeli Conflict in American Political Culture. Thank you very much for coming in today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
That brings us to the end of our show today. Thank you very much for listening. Also big thanks to Alex Benish, the technical producer of this show. I'm Gilad Halpern, signing off here in Tel Aviv. Do join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.